Conrad Hays had stopped counting the days since he'd slept in a real bed. At 52, he carried that kind of math in his body rather than his memory. In the stiffness that met him each morning before he opened his eyes, in the way his right knee locked if he stayed still too long, in the deep ache behind his sternum that had nothing to do with anything a doctor could fix. He lay on a cot in the back room of an abandoned adobe farmhouse in southeastern New Mexico, where the Pecos River had shrunk to a slow brown thread and the cottonwood trees along its banks had begun to die from the top down. The ranch belonged to him now, or what remained of it. Clara Marsh had signed the deed over in a hospital room in Albuquerque 14 months ago, 2 days before she lost the fight that Kevin had lost 6 years before her in a narrow alley outside Fallujah. Kevin Marsh had been the best team leader Conrad had ever served under. The kind of man who checked on his guys before he checked on himself. The kind of man whose widow still baked bread for the neighbors after she lost him. Clara hadn't left Conrad the ranch because it was worth something. She'd left it because she knew he had nowhere else to go. "Don't let it all just disappear," she'd told him, her voice barely above a whisper by then. Kevin loved this place when it had water. Atlas raised his head from the floor beside the cot. The aging German shepherd watched Conrad the way he'd watched him through 3 overseas deployments. With steady amber eyes that didn't ask questions, didn't offer opinions, only bore witness. His muzzle had gone nearly white. A scar ran through his left ear, where shrapnel had caught him during their last tour, the same blast that had ended both their careers. The veterinarian in El Paso had told Conrad 2 years ago that Atlas was slowing down. Conrad had replied that they were slowing down together. He poured the morning coffee into 2 vessels, half into a cracked blue mug, half into a battered aluminum bowl that had traveled more miles than most pickup trucks. Atlas drank first. That was the rule, had been since Ramadi. Outside, the New Mexico sky turned pale gold before the sun cleared the ridge. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it only revealed damage. The irrigation ditches. The old acequias that Spanish settlers had carved through this desert 3 centuries ago had gone dry. The stock pond sat cracked and empty. Even the windmill had quit, its gearbox seized from disuse. Conrad stood on the warped wooden porch and looked at what remained. 500 acres, most of it red clay and scrub juniper. A peeling barn, a mailbox at the end of the drive that had recently started delivering notices from the county tax office. He already knew what the latest one said without opening it. Outstanding balance, delinquent status, foreclosure proceedings to commence. He folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. He had no money to answer it with, only a promise that kept refusing to go quiet. Atlas walked beside him along the fence line as Conrad began his morning work. Patching wire that nothing remained to contain, clearing debris from drainage channels that carried nothing but dust. The physical work helped. When his hands stayed busy, the images from overseas faded to a low frequency instead of filling the entire screen. Near the old south pasture, Atlas stopped. Conrad kept walking a few steps before he noticed the dog hadn't followed. He turned. Atlas stood perfectly still at the edge of what had once been the main acequia. The hand-dug irrigation channel that had carried river water to the ranch for generations before the drought dropped the water table past reaching. The old channel was barely a depression in the earth now, its stone lining crumbled and buried. "Come on," Conrad said. Atlas didn't move. He lowered his nose to the ground at one specific spot, then looked up at Conrad with the particular expression that meant he was not confused and he was not playing. Conrad had seen that look before, in places where it mattered considerably more to pay attention to it. He walked back, crouched beside the dog and pressed his palm against the earth. Dry, hard, ordinary. But Atlas scratched once at the surface, sat, and stared at him with complete patience. "All right," Conrad said finally. He went to get the shovel. The first 2 days produced nothing but blisters and a hole 4 feet deep. The earth in the old acequia bed was compacted to near concrete hardness. Conrad worked mornings and evenings, resting through the worst of the midday heat in the shade of a dead juniper, sharing water with Atlas from the same canteen. His shoulders screamed by the 3rd day. His left knee, reconstructed after a training accident years ago, began complaining with every strike of the blade. He kept going. Ruth Alderman arrived on the 4th morning, driving a sun-faded pickup that rattled like it contained loose silverware. She was 73, a retired high school history teacher who had lived on the neighboring property for 40 years and knew this land the way people know their own handwriting. She had brought a covered plate of food and a look on her face that said she'd heard what he was doing and had opinions about it. "I'm not here to talk you out of anything," she said, setting the plate on the tailgate. "I've been watching old acequias my whole life. You can't talk sense to a man who's committed." Conrad smiled despite himself. "You taught Kevin history. I taught Kevin to read, which took considerably longer." She looked toward the excavation. "How deep?" 4 feet, maybe a little more. She studied the location carefully. "You know who dug this original channel?" "Spanish settlers, I assume." Ruth pulled a worn paperback from her jacket pocket. It was a county historical survey, the kind nobody bothered to digitize. Bernardo de la Vega, 1731. He built 12 miles of acequia through this valley. The survey says his main water works. The cisterns, the storage chambers, were never found after his people left during the drought of 1781. She paused. Nobody ever came back. Conrad looked at the hole, then at Atlas, who had not moved from his post beside it since sunrise. "He's been sitting there every morning," Ruth said quietly. "I know." She watched the dog for a long moment. Old dogs and old land sometimes understand each other better than we do. She placed the food beside the shovel. "Eat something, both of you." By the 9th day, the excavation had reached 12 feet. Conrad had reinforced the walls with boards salvaged from the collapsed barn. The hole had widened enough that he could work without the walls pressing his shoulders. Though sometimes, when he was deep inside and the shadows closed in above him, the shape of the space reminded him of places overseas that he preferred not to remember. On those moments he would stop, press both hands flat against the earthen wall, and breathe until he was certain of where he was. Atlas always appeared at the rim above him when that happened. Always. As though the dog could hear the change in his breathing from 20 feet away. On the afternoon of the 9th day, Conrad's pickaxe struck something that didn't sound like stone. He cleared the loose earth with his hands. A flat surface appeared. Smooth, dark with age. Wood, not rock. Thick planks fitted together without visible fastening, sealed with something that had hardened to the consistency of old wax. He climbed out. His hands were shaking, and not from exhaustion. Atlas stood at the rim, looking down, ears forward. "Yeah," Conrad said quietly, "I see it." He went back for the pry bar. When he wedged it beneath the edge of the planked surface and pushed, the seal broke with a sound like a held breath finally released. A wave of cool air rose from below, dry and perfectly still, carrying the smell of old stone and something faintly mineral, like iron left in rain. Conrad lowered the flashlight into the opening. The beam disappeared into darkness below. He couldn't see the bottom. Above him, Atlas had begun to pace. Back and forth along the rim, a low, continuous sound in his throat that wasn't quite a growl. Not danger, something else. Something Conrad had only heard from the dog twice before, both times at moments of enormous consequence. "Easy," Conrad said. "I'm coming up." He never made it. The eastern wall of the shaft gave without any warning. No crack, no preliminary settling. Simply gone. 300 pounds of compacted desert earth came inward in one movement and took the ladder with it. Conrad threw himself toward the opening in the floor, but the force caught him at the shoulder and drove him sideways. His flashlight spun away. Darkness arrived with absolute completeness. For a full minute, he did not move. Then he began feeling with his hands. Stone floor, smooth, cold, he had fallen through. He was below. Above, Atlas hit the rim of the collapse and began digging before the dust had settled. His front paws tore through loose earth with the focused violence of something that knew exactly what it was doing. Blood came from his pads within minutes. He kept digging. He barked once. A single hard sound, then went back to digging. When it became clear the way down was sealed, he stopped. He raised his head. His nose worked the hot desert air for 3 long seconds. Then he ran. Conrad found the flashlight by feel. Miraculously, it still worked. He clicked it on and sat still for 30 seconds, cataloging damage. His right shoulder had taken the worst of it. His ribs ached on the left side. His knee had twisted in the fall but would hold weight. Nothing was broken. He was alive. He turned the flashlight to the space around him and stopped breathing. The chamber was enormous. Stone walls rose 15 feet on every side, fitted with the same careful craftsmanship as the old Spanish missions he'd seen in Santa Fe. Each block placed precisely, without visible mortar, fitted to its neighbor with a patience that had nothing to do with speed. The ceiling was barrel vaulted, the keystones still perfectly aligned after 3 centuries of desert above them. The air was cool, perfectly still. And in the center of the chamber, standing on a carved stone platform, was a horse. Life-sized, hammered copper, green with age across most of its surface. But where the metal had been struck or abraded over centuries, the original color blazed through. Deep red gold, like fire seen through old glass. The horse stood with its head slightly lowered, calm rather than triumphant, in the posture of something that had worked rather than something that had been displayed. Conrad walked toward it slowly. He ran the flashlight beam across the carved platform beneath the horse and stopped. Maps. The entire surface of the platform was covered in carved lines, channels, branching and converging, circles with numbers beside them in Old Spanish notation, arrows indicating flow direction. The lines extended beyond the platform and continued across the stone floor in shallow relief, leading toward each of the 4 chamber walls. He crouched low and traced one channel with his finger. It led from a symbol he recognized as the Pecos River. The same sinuous shape, the same orientation, and branched upward through the hills in a pattern he could almost feel was familiar. The way a person recognizes a street they haven't driven in years. These weren't treasure maps. They were engineering drawings, waterworks, acequia networks, cisterns, infiltration galleries, designed to capture and store rainfall underground and release it slowly through the dry season. Whoever had built this chamber had spent their lives solving the same problem. Conrad had arrived here to solve. He pressed his back against the carved stone platform and closed his eyes. Above him, somewhere beyond tons of collapsed earth, Atlas was trying to find him. He had to be patient, and he had to trust that the dog would not stop. Atlas reached the county road in 11 minutes. He had never been to the volunteer fire station, but the smell of diesel and radio equipment led him there from the road's edge. He appeared in the station entrance bay and stopped in front of the first person he found and barked once, precisely, and then ran several yards back toward the road and stopped and looked back. The firefighter, a young man who had heard about Conrad Hays from his father, picked up the radio without being asked twice. Fire Captain Rosa Kimball arrived on the scene within 20 minutes, 2 brush trucks and a rescue van behind her. She looked at the collapsed excavation and then at Atlas, who had returned to the rim and was digging again despite the blood on his pads. And she didn't waste time on questions that didn't matter. Get the listening equipment. Start from where the dog is working. We move outward from that point. Underground, Conrad heard the first sounds around the 4-hour mark. Tapping. Irregular at first. Then rhythmic. 3 beats, pause. 3 beats, pause. He found a loose stone and struck the chamber floor 3 times. The answering knock came through the limestone above him, like something heard through water. Faint but real. He struck 3 more times. 3 came back. He sat against the copper horse's platform and allowed himself, for the first time since the collapse, to breathe without measuring the air. "She's still up there," he said to the empty chamber. His voice echoed softly off the old stone. He was talking about the dog, and he was talking about something larger than the dog. She never leaves. The rescue took 19 hours. Rosa Kimball's crew worked with hand tools only. The ground above the chamber was too unstable for heavy machinery. Gil Fontana, whose family had ranched the neighboring land for 4 generations, worked beside the firefighters without being asked, without taking breaks that weren't mandatory. Ruth Alderman arrived with every old survey and historical document she could locate from the County Historical Society, spreading them across a folding table in the dark. At hour 14, a state archaeological liaison arrived in a clean sedan and began speaking about protected historical sites. Captain Kimball listened to him for approximately 45 seconds before informing him that his timeline began after the man underground was standing on top of the ground. The liaison waited by his car. Atlas accepted bandages on his front paws from the paramedic, but returned immediately to his post above the excavation. He never moved more than 3 feet from the rim. When the rescue shaft finally broke through, and Conrad's face appeared in the beam of Rosa Kimball's flashlight, she later said she had never seen anyone look so tired and so certain at the same time. Like a man who had spent 19 hours underground and arrived at something. "I'm all right," he said. "My dog. He's right here," she said. Before Conrad had fully cleared the shaft, Atlas pushed through the gathered crew with the singularity of purpose that had carried him through 2 combat deployments and 19 hours of digging. He pressed his entire body against Conrad's side, hard enough to stagger him. Conrad dropped to one knee. He wrapped both arms around the dog's neck and held on without speaking. The crew looked away. Gil Fontana turned his face toward the dark hills. Ruth Alderman removed her glasses and cleaned them very carefully. The cameras from 3 different television stations caught all of it. Within hours, most of the country had seen it too. Many people talked about the copper horse. Most remembered the dog. The photographs appeared on national news before dawn. By the following afternoon, the coverage had shifted from rescue story to discovery story. And by the day after that, it had become something else entirely, a property story. Stuart Pelham's development company had quietly purchased 11 ranches in the Pecos River Valley over the previous 4 years, every one of them from families who'd run out of water and options. He spoke frequently about economic revitalization in interviews, and had never once mentioned what he planned to build or who it was intended to serve. His representative, a man named Derek Voss, who wore expensive boots and drove a vehicle that had never touched unpaved road, appeared at the edge of the restricted site on the second day. He waited until Conrad had returned from the hospital, cracked ribs, treated and discharged, and found him sitting on the porch with Atlas, watching the government vehicles move across his property. "I know this isn't the right moment," Derek said, "but my employer asked me to reach out before things become more complicated." Conrad said nothing. Derek opened a leather portfolio. $3.5 million. You'd be set for life. Your dog could have the best veterinary care available. Conrad looked at Atlas. The old German Shepherd's wrapped paws were stretched carefully in front of him. The veterinarian had told Conrad the cuts would heal, but that Atlas had likely pushed past what was comfortable for those joints. Conrad had held the dog's face in both hands in the exam room and apologized quietly and Atlas had licked his wrist once as though forgiving was a thing that happened automatically and didn't require making a production of it. "What does Pelham plan to build here?" Conrad asked. "A regional resort development. The economic benefit to the surrounding. Does the plan include completing the Acequia system?" Derek paused. "There would be water infrastructure for the resort." "For the resort," Conrad said, "not for the valley. The surrounding communities would." "No," Conrad said. Derek stayed pleasant. "There's significant room to negotiate the terms." I said no. "My employer anticipated some resistance, Mr. Hays. The offer. The people who built that chamber weren't looking for a resort site." Conrad looked toward the restricted fencing where the old black walnut tree. Ruth had identified it as one de la Vega's descendants had planted in 1740. Stood inside the barriers now. They were trying to solve a water problem. Tell Pelham that's what this land is going to finish doing. Derek left. The leather portfolio went with him, unopened the rest of the way. The county meeting 3 weeks later drew more people than the building had seen in decades. Conrad sat at the front table, with Ruth Alderman and Rosa Kimball on either side of him. Atlas lay under the table, with his paws finally unwrapped and healing. The state archaeologist spoke first. He was more thoughtful than Conrad had expected, once he'd had time to study the chamber rather than protect his jurisdiction. "The carved maps," he explained, "represented one of the most complete pre-industrial water engineering records in the American Southwest. De la Vega's Acequia network had been within 200 feet of tapping a significant underground aquifer when the drought of 1781 forced his community to abandon the work. The copper horse appeared in every map as a recurring symbol, not treasure, a fixed landmark to navigate from underground, a reference point for whoever came next." The room was very quiet. A county commissioner asked the question slowly. "So the chamber was never a vault?" "It was a field office," the archaeologist said, "for people who died before they could finish the job." Conrad stood when it was his turn. He was not comfortable speaking to rooms. He'd spent most of his adult life in small teams, in darkness, in spaces where fewer words were better. But he looked at the people in the chairs. Ranchers whose families had been in this valley for 4 and 5 generations. Young people who'd come back to help parents who had no one else. And he said what needed saying. "I didn't dig that hole looking for copper. I dug it because the land is dying, and I made a promise to 2 people who loved it when it wasn't." He looked at the window, at the brown hills visible through the glass. "Whatever belongs to history should be handled by people who know how to care for it. Any money connected to that chamber should go into finishing what those builders started. Not one ranch. Every ranch in this valley. Every family that's been watching their water run out." Stuart Pelham, who had arrived uninvited and positioned himself near the back of the room, left before the vote. The Valley Acequia Restoration Fund was established by unanimous vote. The engineers from the State University spent 6 weeks cataloging every carved line in the chamber before any drilling began. The first attempt failed. The second found fractured limestone. By the time the third rig was positioned, some of the valley had begun to lose hope again, in the particular way that communities lose hope when they've already been disappointed. Quietly, without wanting anyone to notice, Atlas walked away from the survey team's equipment on the afternoon of the third attempt and stopped at a point 40 yards northwest of where the engineers had focused their attention. He lowered his nose to the red clay, circled once, with the careful deliberateness of an animal that had learned not to waste effort, and then looked at Conrad. Conrad had stopped watching the drill. The lead engineer, Dr. Patricia Ossie from Las Cruces, followed his gaze. "We've already scanned that section," she said. "He was right the last time," Conrad said simply. She looked at the old German shepherd, at his white muzzle. at the way he stood with his full weight over that one patch of ground, motionless, as though he'd grown roots there. She ordered the drill moved. It took 4 hours to reposition and another full day to reach depth. The valley watched. A few television crews that had drifted away returned when word spread that another attempt was underway. Most assumed it would end the same way. The drill hit the aquifer at 230 feet. The water came up cold and clear, and with enough force that the crew stepped back from the platform before the column crested. It caught the late afternoon light as it fell, and scattered it across 30 feet of red New Mexico desert in a curtain of silver and gold. The sound it made was unlike anything anyone present had heard in years. It was the sound of something that had been waiting a long time to be let out. Nobody spoke for almost a full minute. Then Gil Fontana, who had not cried in public since his father's funeral, removed his hat and pressed it against his face. Ruth Alderman covered her mouth with both hands. Dr. Osie's assistant laughed, a startled, involuntary sound, and then laughed again and didn't stop. Atlas had not moved from his spot. He stood with the water misting across his graying coat and looked at Conrad, with the same expression he had carried for 17 years to communicate one simple thing. Conrad walked to him and crouched and held both palms gently against the sides of the old dog's face. "You found it," he said. "Both times, you found it." He cupped the icy water in one hand and held it beneath Atlas's muzzle. The old dog drank slowly, patiently, the first fresh groundwater to rise from beneath the valley in a generation. Only after Atlas finished did Conrad lift the water to his own lips. It tasted clean and cold, and like something that had been traveling a very long way to arrive. He closed his eyes. For a moment he imagined Kevin Marsh standing beside him. He imagined Clara smiling from somewhere quieter than hospitals. He imagined Bernardo de la Vega, and every worker who had hauled stone through the desert heat of 1731 and never knew they were leaving something behind for the exact right person to find. The valley did not recover overnight. Recovery never works that way. It came in small adjustments. One dry ditch that began carrying water again. One windmill that turned for the first time in 4 years. One family that unpacked the boxes they had started filling. Gil Fontana brought cattle back to his south pasture in the spring. Only 12 head. But when Conrad watched them lower their heads to drink from a restored watering trough, he smiled more deeply than he had in years. Ruth Alderman reopened the historical room at the county library and began bringing school children in on Fridays. She never started with the copper horse. She started by writing a single sentence on the chalkboard. They searched for water so others could live. Then she told them about the people who had never quit. The Spanish settlers, the volunteers, the firefighters, and one aging military dog who had understood something the rest of them had to learn. The copper horse was eventually moved to the new regional museum in town. The first display visitors encountered was not the horse. It was a photograph, Atlas, standing at the rim of the collapse, front paws bleeding, in the flat morning light of a day when he had already decided that digging wasn't sufficient and running was necessary. Below the photograph, a small placard read, "He already knew. He was just waiting for us to catch up." Thousands of visitors paused there, longer than they paused in front of the copper horse. School children ask the same question every week. Was he really the one who found it? The museum guides always answered the same way. He found much more than that. Stuart Pelham quietly sold his valley properties the following year. With the groundwater restored and the community rebuilding, the speculation he'd counted on had evaporated. He did not grant interviews about it. Some lessons happen without witnesses. The winter Atlas died was mild, as New Mexico winters sometimes are, more cold light than cold air. He slowed gradually in the way that old working dogs slow, with dignity and without complaint, until one morning he simply could not stand without help and looked at Conrad with eyes that were still perfectly clear, only tired in a way that had nothing left to fight. Conrad carried him to the place beneath the old black walnut tree, where the first successful well had been drilled. He sat beside him in the thin January sun and talked for a while. Not about anything important. Just the ordinary things that fill the days of two partners who have been moving through the world together long enough that silence and conversation have become mostly the same thing. He told Atlas about the spring planting, about the letter he'd received from a veteran in Colorado who had watched the news and wanted to know how it turned out, about the way the cottonwoods along the Pecos were showing new growth at their bases, working back up from the roots. Atlas's breathing slowed through the afternoon. Conrad kept his hand on the dog's neck the entire time, feeling the rise and fall of it, until the rise and fall stopped, quietly, just before the sun hit the western ridge. Conrad stayed beside him until the stars appeared. Then he stayed a while longer. The neighbors came without being called. The way neighbors do when they know the kind of loss that doesn't announce itself but arrives like weather, filling all the available space. Gil Fontana brought cedar boards. Rosa Kimball carried tools. Ruth Alderman arrived with wildflowers gathered from the hillsides that had turned green again, the same hillsides that had been nothing but dust the year before. The veterans arrived at sunset. Pickup trucks came from 2 counties away. Men and women in faded unit caps stepped out and walked to the walnut tree, without needing directions, and stood in the quiet way that people stand when they are honoring something they recognize. One by one they placed challenge coins in a circle at the base of the marker. Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, Coast Guard. Different uniforms, different wars, the same gravity. No speeches were needed. One former medic finally said the thing they were all thinking. We all knew a dog like him. Heads moved around the circle. He carried us, another said simply. Atlas's marker was cedar, the same boards Gil had brought. Simple, no grand monument, just the wood and the carved words. Atlas, he found what he came to find. 5 years later, on an evening in late October, when the air had turned cool enough to carry the smell of the first distant rain, Conrad climbed the small hill overlooking the ranch. The valley below held the golden light of sunset across healthy pasture and turning cottonwoods, and the silver threads of restored acequia channels, moving water the way they were always meant to. He carried 2 cups of coffee. He placed one beside the cedar marker, just as he had done every Sunday morning since January. Then he sat in the grass. A little girl who had come with her family from Albuquerque to see the museum tugged at her grandfather's sleeve and pointed at the marker beneath the black walnut tree. What does it say? The old man read it aloud to her. What did he find? She asked. Her grandfather was quiet for a moment. He looked at the valley, the green fields, the families gathered in the late afternoon light, the windmills turning, the water moving through the old channels De La Vega had carved and Conrad had finished. The same thing they all found, he said. She waited. Each other, he said. The water moved through the valley all night, steady and unhurried, the same way it would move tomorrow and through all the dry seasons still to come. Not because the hard times were over, but because the work had finally been finished by the people it was always meant for, in the place it was always meant to reach.